Okay, now I can go on to our program today. As we close out March, on to April, yay. As we close out March and Women's History Month, we're so proud and happy to be able to welcome Fredie Kay. She is the founder and president of the Massachusetts Women's History Center, and she's going to talk to you today about the women's suffrage movement. Thank you, Fredie.
Thank you.
Try that. It'll be a little better if I can. Do that. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah. I really appreciate being here and this invitation, and thank you all for coming today and for your interest in women's history, particularly during Women's History Month. Now, our organization is year-round, but we really love Women's History Month because people focus on it then. So this is a great opportunity for us. Thank you. So I really appreciate that and the Walpole Council on Aging for this wonderful program. I would like to recognize that we reside on land here in Massachusetts that was home to many Native American tribes. The Massachusetts tribe, I believe in particular, that moved through and lived upon this land for centuries. I invite us all to contemplate how better to support the indigenous community and how to honor and care for the land that each of us inhabits. A primary goal of the Women's History Center is to share the often unknown history of women throughout the centuries, really, and in particular, I'm going to focus on women's suffrage. By background, I will mention that the organization, Mass Women's History Center, is only about a year old, but we are based on 14 years of an organization that was called Suffrage 100 Massachusetts. And that was because for 14 years we focused on commemorating women obtaining the vote with the centennial in 2020 of the 19th Amendment. And I'll get into that in a moment. So what happened was at the end of the centennial, which you may recall was the pandemic, so we could not march on Boston Common as we had hoped, but we did make a movie. We have a 30-minute film, and it's online, and I'll tell you how to get there. But we also decided not to close, even though the centennial had finished for the 19th Amendment, and I also talk about other laws that had to change so that women and many groups could vote, men and women, Native Americans, Asian Americans, even though the 19th Amendment does not discriminate, other laws prevented Native Americans from voting, Asian Americans from voting, et cetera. So I talk a little bit about that. We decided not to close, that it was no time to close. Things were getting a little, shall we say the sky was starting to fall on women's issues. So we decided to stay open and expand with suffrage as our base, but to cover all of Massachusetts women's history. And we are also starting a Massachusetts Women's Hall of Fame. Some other states have them, not every state, but many, and we don't. So we're starting a Massachusetts Women's Hall of Fame, and that's in process now. So that's the foundation, and that's where I'm going to dive into a little bit of history, that some of which you may know and some of which you may not. I certainly didn't grow up with it. I had to learn all this. I'm an attorney by training, but became an amateur historian about 14 years ago when I started this project. So I'm the founder and president of the organization. We are virtual. The Massachusetts Women's History Center is currently online with a wonderful website with exhibits and articles, biographies, and we hope to get a brick and mortar spot where we can open and have a physical space, preferably on the Freedom Trail in Boston is what we're looking into. So with that, I'll dive in a little bit here and talk about it. A lot of it is to help answer that big question about why did it take so long to get the vote? And how did women finally get the vote over the centuries? The answer, I think, is radical brave women. They were radical. They didn't look radical, but they were radical, and they were very, very brave, and men who participated in it. And remember that the only way that women could get the vote was if men voted for it. So we needed you guys. Like, we couldn't get the vote unless the men voted for it. We had no vote. So I'm going to start off, let me see where I am here. And, Lydia Taft of Uxbridge. She became the first recorded female voter in America in 1756. It happened because her husband passed away, and she became the landowner and taxpayer of the estate. Now, I have to note that was unusual, because usually if a father died, the land and everything went to his son, right? And the women were skipped over. Mothers, sisters skipped over. But in this case, it went to her. And so the town agreed that, that she would vote as the widow of Josiah Taft and to vote in his place. And that was October 30th, 1756, in an Uxbridge open town meeting in favor of appropriating funds for the regiments engaged in the French and Indian War. It took 164 years after that for women to get the vote. So the next person I want to talk about is Mom Bet, or Elizabeth Freeman. She was born in 1742. She was a Revolutionary War widow and was enslaved by a powerful Massachusetts attorney, John Ashley. And Mom Bet, Elizabeth Freeman, could not read or write, but she could listen and she could understand. She knew she was enslaved. And John Taft, this attorney, had many prominent people around their dining room table, and she heard them speaking about the new Constitution in Massachusetts, which you know became the foundation for our federal Constitution. And she heard them talking about all men are born free and equal. And we know in those days, did men mean men and women, or did men mean men? Not clear. But she went to an attorney and sued and said, well, I want my freedom. And her case and others went to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court to declare slavery illegal in Massachusetts under our Constitution. And in 1781, she was granted her freedom. And what's interesting is her statute, a statue of Mom Bet, and Phyllis Wheatley, who I'll talk about in a moment, is prominently included, a huge statue, in the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. I went there recently and walked in and went, oh, look at that, 2 Massachusetts women. It was very cool. I also want to talk about Abigail Adams, who I'm sure you've heard about, and we all know the phrase, remember the ladies, when she wrote to her husband in 1776. Well, the rest of her quote is actually quite interesting, and you may not have heard it. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Yeah, that's like, go Abigail, right? Her husband's response was, quote, depend upon it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. He said, no, forget it. As you may know, there's a relatively new statue of Abigail Adams in Quincy in the Adams-Hancock Common. It's beautiful. And she is one of the 3 women on the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth Avenue, which is Abigail Adams, Phyllis Wheatley, and Lucy Stone. It's a great memorial, and I could talk about it for a long time, but I'm going to move ahead in time because I'm trying to get to like 1920 and beyond in a short period of time. I'm going to do my best. This is a slide of the Grimke sisters, who you may have heard about. Now, these are women who may not look like it. These are radical women, right? They don't strike you as radical. They were radical. Sarah was born in 1792 and Angelina in 1805. They were raised on a plantation in South Carolina where their parents owned slaves. Sarah and Angelina were 2 of 14 children, and their father sometimes had them work in the fields, so they observed how the slaves were treated, and it was awful. So in 1820s, they moved north to Philadelphia and became Quakers and abolitionists, and eventually they moved to Boston. They became speakers for William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist. But if the audiences included men and women, those were called promiscuous audiences. That was the name. And often, if women spoke, rotten fruit was thrown at the women. They truly had no voice. They were not supposed to speak. So just speaking, particularly in front of an audience of men and women, was not done. It was socially unacceptable. Women were not to speak, and they had no voice. And that practice of throwing rotten fruit at women continued. I have examples in the early 1900s. When women were trying to get the vote, the same thing was happening. In 1838, Angelina Grimke became the first woman in the country to address a state legislature, and it was at our Massachusetts State House. And it was earth-shattering. Now, why was that so earth-shattering? And it relates to what I was just saying. Why were they throwing fruit at the women? The issues were that the men and women were supposed to be and were in separate spheres. And these women who were speaking out in a public sphere were challenging what was called the cult of true womanhood. That is, the idea that the only true woman was a pious, submissive wife and mother concerned exclusively with home and family. So they were challenging that, as were many others. The Grimke sisters moved to New Jersey for a while, and then in 1864, the family moved to Hyde Park in Massachusetts, where in 1870, the 2 sisters attempted to vote in a local election. And a bridge has been named in Hyde Park for the Grimke sisters that was unveiled November 2019. And you can go see the bridge. So moving along. And now we have our own. And I think what's so fascinating about this is that there's so much Massachusetts history that took place right here that was impactful nationally, but it was coming out of Massachusetts, which was really quite cool. We have a lot to be proud of. Lucretia and James Mott were Quakers. Lucretia was born in 1793 on Nantucket. And I love the story about her. Her father they were Quakers, devout Quakers. Her father worked on ships. He was a sailor. And I learned about how they would go off to sea for months at a time and not come back. And, in those days, you couldn't pay them by electronic payment, right? So they weren't paid, and that meant their families back home had no money to operate, to live. So Lucretia's mother decided to take a boat to Boston and buy goods that she would then sell in Nantucket. But there were several children who needed to be looked after. Lucretia was the second oldest. I think she was about 10 years old when her mother would take off and come back at the end of a very long day. The children were fed. They'd been given their lessons. The house was clean. She was an amazing person from a very young age, and also a scholar as well. So she ended up marrying James Mott, and they moved to Pennsylvania. She became more and more renowned and was elected as a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840, which was held in London. I'll have you hold that thought for a minute. I want to talk about somebody else. And that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born in upstate New York It's interesting in both cases, the influence of the father being away in Lucretia's case. In this case, her father was around quite a bit. He was a judge, an attorney. He had law cases in the house where often it was women coming to him seeking help. My husband has died. My son got the property and he's selling the house. What am I supposed to do? And Elizabeth was furious. She was really upset that there was nothing she could do or he could do. And his law clerks often made fun of her. They would tease her and say, you know that necklace that your father brought you, that you treasure so much, that coral necklace? When you get married, it will be owned by your husband. Because when you get married, you lose all your property. It's all owned by your husband. And if your husband wants to sell it, he can. He can sell it for tobacco and smoke it up. So she was just devastated at these laws. She was also brilliant. She studied several languages. She constantly wanted to get her father's approval. And at one point, he just said to her, "If only you were a boy," which really broke her heart. But she tried both academically and athletics. She was a terrific athlete. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, upstate New York, ends up getting married, and she and her husband are living in Boston. And for their honeymoon, where did they go? The World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, England. These were dedicated people. Let me move this along. So this is the World Anti-Slavery Convention in England. What's so interesting to me, I think, is these women and their spouses crossed the ocean, along with many others, to get to this. You don't jump a plane back then. It's a big journey to go on a ship. And when they got there, the first day of the convention was dedicated to a debate about whether the women should be allowed to vote at the convention. Now, these women had crossed this ocean. They'd been elected, et cetera, et cetera. After a full day of debate, they lost. And the women were seated separately, which you can see them down at the bottom here in this rendition. They were separated. William Lloyd Garrison was late. He arrived late. He was furious. He supported the women, and he sat with them in protest. He sat with the women during the convention. And another person joined him. His name is Charles Remond from Salem, Massachusetts, an African-American man, and he also joined the women in protest. The story goes that Elizabeth and Lucretia, now Lucretia was a bit older, probably closer to her 50s or so. She was a well-established speaker. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a young bride, basically. This was her honeymoon. But the story is they looked at each other and said, we need a women's convention. And out of that grew, fast forward 8 years later, to 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention. Let me see if it matches here. So there is Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband had moved to Seneca Falls. Her husband did not like the big city of Boston, wanted a quiet practice, so they moved to Seneca Falls. Lucretia Mott had a younger sister who was pregnant and living in a nearby town. She came to visit her sister, and they reconnected. And they reconnected frequently, they talk about it over tea. They would have tea, and these women were meeting. There's a house where they met for tea and decided, we have to do this now. We need a convention. Let's get people together right now. Within 3 days, they put notices in newspapers. They got the church at the time, the hall, and Lucretia Mott was the draw. She was only in town for a few days, but they knew if they could have a convention and advertise that Lucretia Mott is speaking, that would draw a crowd. And it did, about 300 people, including Frederick Douglass. He lived nearby in Rochester, read it in a newspaper, and he came. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was charged with writing, what's our wish list? What do we want? What are we asking for? And she created what she called the Declaration of Sentiments based on the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal. She included many rights that women needed for property and so forth, and she included the right to vote. Lucretia Mott thought, too much, it's too much, they'll make fun of us, which they did. They'll make fun of us, and we just, that's too fast, we need it more incrementally. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton believes strongly, no, the vote is the cornerstone. And Frederick Douglass agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and helped argue, debate at this convention to say women must have the vote. It was adopted, not unanimously. Every other item on the Declaration of Sentiments was adopted unanimously except the right to vote. And it foretold this huge challenge that these were their friends, so to speak, the challenge that lied ahead. So we do thank Frederick Douglass for being an ally, as we say today, for the women. Let me catch up with my notes here. I do want to mention the Native Americans who, there were many, many tribes up in upstate New York, and the Haudenosaunee were very important to this. Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and others had become students of the tribe and realized that their dream was before them because women possessed rights beyond their dreams. White women were corseted and ornamented, non-persons in the eyes of the law, but in the Haudenosaunee tribe, they were equals. Lucretia Mott and her husband visited the Cattaraugus tribe, where they observed women, quote, exercising equal authority and discussion and decision-making among the Seneca Nation. So these women, these white women, were learning it was possible. There could be equality in your community and in your, among your people. So let me go on here. This is the Declaration of Sentiments that I just talked about. There were about 300 people who attended. And I think I have Frederick Douglass here, who was born in 1818. And escaped to the North in 1838. In 1848, the same year as this convention, he started his newspaper and was just becoming a public speaker. And so it was early in his speaking career, but he was strong and great and made a big difference at this convention. What we often don't know about is that while Seneca Falls was the first women's rights convention, the first national women's rights convention was in Worcester, Massachusetts. I sort of feel like, who knew? Like, right? And it's coming up on their big anniversary. They're having a huge two-day events in Worcester. It was held for 2 years. So what's the difference? Why is one the first women's rights and one is the first national women's right? The difference is that the one in Seneca Falls had about 300 people regionally. They came from nearby. When they got to Worcester, they advertised this far. There were about 11 different states represented and over 1,000 people. It got bigger and bigger. It was held for 2 years in a row, and a huge proponent of this was Lucy Stone. And there are many others who you can see here as well. Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, Abby Kelly Foster, huge figure in the abolition and suffrage movement. Paulina Kellogg Wright Davis, Frederick Douglass was there, Ernestine Rose and Lucretia Mott. Ernestine Rose was a Jewish woman from Poland who escaped an arranged marriage by her rabbi father and walked miles and miles to get to a judge to have her marriage annulled. I believe it was to an older gentleman. She was not, this was not her idea, it was her father's idea. She had her marriage annulled and left. And ended up, somehow, she went to England, I know, and ended up at this convention and became a spectacular speaker for women's rights. And I remember reading that people couldn't figure out her accent. What's her accent? What was that? Which I think must have sounded very Slavic. It was Polish, maybe Ukrainian, that part of the world, I think. So these are the spectacular women that put this together for two years in a row. Now, what did happen, remember I talked about how Lucretia Mott said they'll make fun of us? Yeah, well, they did. And so this is a cartoon drawing of the hecklers of the women. And while they made fun of them in the press and newspapers, which they did, it also earned them many supporters because, you know that old phrase, all press is good press? It's sort of like you want to be in the newspapers even if it's bad news. In this case, they were making fun of them, but there were many women who were sympathetic to that and men who said, no, this is a good cause. So it definitely increased those who were supportive of this. And I'm just checking my notes. In 1850, there were 11 states and 1,000 women and men. And in 1851, the Second National Women's Rights Convention, 3,000 people attended. So they have a lot to celebrate. And there were annual conventions for about 10 years in different parts around the country for women's suffrage. And as you can tell, they were working together, abolitionists and suffragists, trying to both end slavery and for women's rights. Let me see if I have... Okay, so this is a drawing. I've just checked my notes here. This is Amelia Bloomer. Now, I expect many of you have heard of bloomers, right? So that's named after Amelia. She didn't design them, but she popularized them. She wore them all over the place. And this is a statue in Seneca Falls of Amelia Bloomer introducing Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So that's a monumental meeting of a partnership which came to work together for decades. And that's a statue you can see in Seneca Falls. So you can see how the women, just by having bloomers, even though they could move, because before women had these dresses on the ground, I can't imagine the cleaning challenge that afforded these women. And just to have bloomers would mean they could move and not trip and so forth. So it was a big deal. Unfortunately, it didn't hold. I remember Susan B. Anthony wore, and they called it a costume. She wore bloomers, same thing. All the press wanted to talk about was what she was wearing. Sound familiar? Yeah. Right, it's, okay, so you get it, I know you get it. This is Lucy Stone and her husband. She was born in West Brookfield, and her husband, Henry Blackwell. Lucy Stone is the first woman from Massachusetts to graduate from college. She went to Oberlin. Henry tried for 2 years to persuade her to marry, and she finally agreed after they had created an agreement where she would keep her property rights upon marriage and keep her name. And so those who keep their name are sometimes called Lucy Stoners, for those who keep their name. So they were publisher and editor of the Women's Journal, a national publication for over 40 years about women. There we go, the Women's Journal. Sorry?
And she was older than him.
I didn't see that. Is that in?
Yeah.
Thank you.
7 years old.
Oh, that's big. Thank you. I hadn't noticed that. Thank you. So this is the Women's Journal, which I said was a national weekly publication for over 40 years. Let me go on here. And this is a slide about Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frances Harper, abolitionists and suffragists, each of them. They worked for both, and they would often talk about, they didn't have the luxury of working for one or the other. They needed to work for both. And the 15th Amendment was ratified February 3rd, 1870. Abolitionists and suffragists had been working together, as I mentioned, together for universal suffrage for all people until the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote, but not women. And it split the movement, the women's movement. Supporters said a partial victory, like half a loaf is better than none, and others said, no, we want a whole loaf or nothing. So it was a huge split in the movement among the women and the men, and it was a really rough time. There were some pretty racist statements that were made by Elizabeth and Susan B. Anthony, and it split the organizations into two. And they became the National Woman Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association, with Lucy Stone and Henry Brown Blackwell. I think it's his sister who was the first doctor in Massachusetts. I have to check that, but great family. And then Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were split and divided for over 20 years in their efforts, and their children ultimately brought them back together. I'll get back to that in a second. In the middle, we have Susan B. Anthony. She argued that the newly adopted 14th Amendment applied to her, that she should have equal rights to vote. And the judge, she was arrested for voting. She tried to vote along with some others. And at her trial, the judge made what I'm sure he later thought was a big mistake. He said, and Miss Susan B. Anthony, do you have anything to say? Did she ever? And that speech, I think, went, we would call it viral today, across the country, and she became very well known for her efforts because she gave them an earful about rights of women and how they participate in this country and they deserve the right to vote. Let me just catch up. So that made national news and gathered a lot of support. There is a film I have to recommend on Netflix that's called, it's a documentary about the 14th Amendment, and it's called Amend, A-M-E-N-D, and it's a terrific documentary all about the 14th Amendment. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Okay, Louisa May Alcott, the first woman in Concord to vote for school committee. Now, we know her as a writer and an author. She was also a suffragist, a feminist. And so she was able to be the first woman in Concord to vote for school committee. So how did that happen? In Massachusetts, they changed the law. It was happening in some other places. The argument that women had was, you're not giving us the vote, but you're telling us that we're in charge of the children, that we are supposed to educate them and teach them. So if the education of the children is our purview, you should give us a vote on the school committee because we're just taking care of the kids. And it worked. And so they did get the ability to vote for school committee in Massachusetts and some other states as well. And she was so proud to be able to vote. And other African-American women in Massachusetts voted as well. So it was, what's today's date? The 27th. March 29, in 2 days, is the anniversary of when Eliza May Alcott was the first to vote, along with 19 other women who joined her at the Concord town meeting. And to keep up with some of this, I don't know if any of you are on social media. We post frequently 2 or 3 times a week with history kind of the day and birthdays and so forth. So I encourage you to check us out. Keep going here. So I want to talk a minute about Black women's clubs. And women's clubs in general, I think I heard some chatter about women's clubs. Women's clubs came into their heyday around the turn of the century, and they became extremely popular. And Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, this woman on the right, helped found the NAACP, of the Boston chapter of the NAACP, was an incredible woman, lived on Beacon Hill on Charles Street. There's a plaque where her house is, where she lived. There's a big story about her when she went to a convention of white women, and she had a badge on, being a part of the organization. Somebody ripped her badge off, and that made national news. So it inspired her to create her own and to create a Black women's club. She did it with Mariah Baldwin, who was 40 years at a school in Cambridge. And if you drive around Cambridge, there's a school, it's called the Maria Baldwin School. She improved mathematics education, established parent-teacher groups, and introduced the position of school nurse. So she was way ahead of her time, pushing the envelope for what kids needed, and ended up becoming the head of the school. She'd been a teacher and moved her way up and was the head of the school. E.E. Cummings was a student of hers, and he wrote about her and how much he admired her and all that she did. She also was a founder of the NAACP in Boston. In the spring of 2023, our organization was very pleased to unveil a suffrage marker, it's called, for Maria Baldwin in Cambridge. So we have 5 markers. I'll talk about that in a minute, but one of them is for Maria Baldwin. We could not do one for Josephine because the organization funding the program said, oh, there's already a plaque on the wall. We won't fund one, then it's already covered. And it's like, no, but it's really small, and we'd like to do something bigger, but we'll find another way to honor Josephine. In 1895, they organized the first National Conference of Black Women to address issues important to African Americans, including lynchings. And these women were also suffragists. The other organizations I talked about, let me see what's next here. I'll get there in a second. So the name, remember I had 2 organizations up. One was the American Women's Suffrage, the National, now they rejoined, and they're the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And their children had a lot to do with it. I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton's children, Lucy Stone's daughter, they had a lot to do with bringing these groups back together, which was great. So they formed this organization, which became, that was in 1890, and that's the group that was so active up until 1920. More about that in a second. So this organization focused primarily, how are women supposed to get the vote? And there are 2 main efforts. One was state by state by state to change the laws of the state, the Constitution, whatever, to enable women to vote. The other was to get a constitutional amendment. The first effort focus was on state by state, and that was primarily what this organization was doing. But other people were getting very impatient. So these 2 women, Carrie Chapman Catt, fabulous, and Anna Howard Shaw. Anna Howard Shaw was at BU. She became a minister and a dentist, I believe. She had a ministry on the Cape, and they were both really important. Interesting, Carrie Chapman Catt was a terrific leader. Anna Howard Shaw was a great scholar and minister, perhaps, but turned out to be not as great a leader. So they ended up bringing Carrie Chapman back for a while. Alice Paul. How many of you ever heard of Alice Paul? Very few. I hadn't either until about 14 years ago. Alice Paul has everything to do with the 19th Amendment, along with Carrie Chapman Catt. Alice Paul was born in New Jersey. She was a Quaker, a lot of Quakers in this movement, because they did talk about equality, and she grew up learning about equality in her household. She got a degree here and then went to England for a master's degree, I believe, in economics. So she was with a lot of men and saw a flyer to go hear a woman named Christabel Pankhurst, who was the daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of the suffrage movement in England. And so Alice Paul went to she rode her bike. There's a whole thing about bicycles and the suffrage movement because she couldn't there was a freedom to bicycle riding. So she rode her bike in the night to go to hear this woman speak. There were a lot of men at this convention and at this speaking presentation. And sure enough, the men were throwing rotten fruit at Christabel Pankhurst. And that appalled Alice. She was so upset by that. And she also joined up and joined the suffrage movement in England and became what we might call today radicalized, because the British movement had two components. One were the suffragists, ISTS, and the other started blowing up buildings. They were throwing rocks in windows. They broke the law. And when they did that, they were arrested and they were put in jail. And then the women went on hunger strikes. And then they were force-fed because the government didn't want anybody to die. They didn't want any martyrs among the movement. So they force-fed them. It was horrible. I think Alice Paul survived about 60 times in jail and being force-fed. The newspapers wanted to make fun, we have a theme here, of these women, and they dubbed them the suffragettes. And that's where the name suffragette comes from. It was the newspapers. And the women, including Emmeline Pankhurst, the great leader, said, oh, fine, call us the suffragettes. And so they took on the name. In the States, they never broke the law. They did not throw bricks. They did not break the law. But sometimes they were called the suffragettes, but really they were all suffragists, is the correct term in the United States. Keep going here. So this is in Britain, Deeds Not Words. That was Emmeline Pankhurst. And, you know, there are many PBS, at this point, pretty old documentaries, but they're amazing. And I think I watched them in the 80s or something. They were incredible. Those were the British suffragettes, and that's Emmeline Pankhurst. And by the way, Emmeline Pankhurst came to Boston. She spoke at the Tremont Church on Tremont Street to raise money. She was here, which was pretty amazing. So the Great Suffrage Parade of 1913, that you may have heard of if any of you watched The Vote on PBS. Alice Paul came back to the States with her friend, another American, Lucy Burns, and together they started a new movement. They were looking at the statistics and at the time and said, wait, 1848, 1850, these conventions, it's now 50 years later, 60 years later. I think about 11 states had adopted suffrage for women, starting with Wyoming. That's another story, why out west. The East Coast was the last. That's where the spheres were really separated. And Alice was impatient, said, this is ridiculous. We need a constitutional amendment. So she brilliantly learned. In those days, the presidential inauguration took place in March. And they scheduled their parade the day before the inauguration. Woodrow Wilson shows up at Union Station, and nobody's there to greet him. He and his wife, he says, where is everybody? And they go, oh, they're all over at the Women's March. And there were thousands at this Women's March. And there were African-American women there. There's a huge story about that I'll tell about. This is the Massachusetts delegation, which was really, really wonderful. And I have to check my notes, which was really, really great. So let me just move on. I need to check the time. Oh my gosh. All right, we're not quite there, but I'm going to try. The 1913 parade, one of the women who came was Ida B. Wells, who you may have heard of, famous journalist, African-American, born into slavery. She was in Chicago, did an enormous amount of writing and work on lynching to try to get lynchings to end, but she was also a suffragist, created a club in Chicago, and they traveled to this march, this parade in Washington, D.C. In Washington, they worried because they were going after a constitutional amendment, they wanted the support in Congress. They needed congressional support. And which were the states that were opposed to women's suffrage? The southern states. They didn't like blacks, they didn't like women, they weren't going to give anybody their rights. So it put the organizers in a terrible position. They didn't want to upset the people from the South, so they made the decision that the blacks would have to march in the back of the parade. Very offensive, obviously, to Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells would not take no for an answer. She hid in the crowd with two white women allies, and when her her group passed by, they snuck in and joined the march. They said, so we can give her a round of applause. That's for Alice Paul. I'm very pleased to say that her great-granddaughter is Michelle Duster, and she wrote a book called Ida B. the Queen. Michelle lives in Chicago, and I'm honored to say she's a friend. And we've done some things together, and I hope to get her to Boston. I've seen her in Chicago and in Washington because the U.S. Mint has just released, well, it was prior to January, they've released a quarter with Ida B. Wells on it. And there was an event in Washington I was able to go for the unveiling of this quarter. And there are going to be, I think it's 20 women on quarters, finally, which is great. So I think what's interesting about that march in 1913, I'm going to quote, when President Biden was inaugurated, he said, quote, "Here we stand looking out on the Great Mall where Dr. King spoke of his dream. Here we stand where 108 years ago, at another inaugural, thousands of protesters tried to block brave women." And they did. I didn't talk about that. They had this huge parade, and the men tried to block them. They were drunk and rowdy. Women were hurt. About 100 of them ended up in the hospital, and they made the news. They were in the paper. And it was interesting because Carrie Chapman Catt was known as prim and proper. She thought it was horrible that these women had been injured and that they were in the paper for their injuries, whereas Alice Paul thought, this is good, we need publicity. And that sets up this dynamic between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul that's really big. Sorry, back to this quote. At another inaugural, thousands of protesters tried to block brave women marching for the right to vote. And today we mark the swearing in of the first woman in history elected to national office, Vice President Kamala Harris. Don't tell me things can't change. Just leave it at that. And I know I need to get through some of this pretty quickly. Massachusetts, we didn't have the vote. So there were efforts going on to change our state laws so that we could vote. And in 1915, so 2 years after this, there was a huge parade in Boston. The vote was November 1915. In October, and frankly, the year before, they had a huge parade. Now, I want to set up the size for you. Just after, in January 2017, the Women's March in Boston and all around the country, Washington, around the world, were protest march. That was the pink hat time. In Boston, there were 175,000 people. Okay, I'm glad you're sitting down. You ready for this? In 1915, they had a parade for women to get the vote, to change the laws. 500,000 people in Boston. And the year before, 200,000 to 300,000. Who knew? We don't know this stuff. That's why we have this organization, frankly. So, and a month after that parade, it was defeated at the ballot box. Massachusetts women didn't, and you can imagine how they felt. They had put on these massive parades for 2 years in a row. It lost in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, several states, and I believe there was a famous meeting at Faneuil Hall to discuss what are our next steps? This is horrible. What are our next steps? I know Lucy Stone's daughter was very involved in that. And the question was, should we try again, or should we focus on a constitutional amendment? In Massachusetts, they decided to focus on a constitutional amendment. New York said, let's try again. Now, when they try again, the entire state, and that's a big state, Massachusetts is big enough, whenever they do this, there are women and men working around the clock all over doing bazaars, selling things. In Massachusetts, they had something called the Bluebirds. They put them up. So we commemorate the Bluebirds in July because they made them famous. That was another symbol for women to get the vote in Massachusetts. So New York tried again in 1917, and they got it. And that was a huge breakthrough because New York was such a big state with so many people. It also meant that in the states where women had the vote, they could participate in the national election. So they had leverage, if you will, with the president, or so they thought. So they were trying with Woodrow Wilson for years. Let me just check my my notes here. So this must be, that's the parade in Boston. We voted 10 states, why not Massachusetts? I said 11, and I thought it was, but they're saying it was 10? Okay. Oh, sorry. Wait, okay. There we go. Okay, so now what happens? These are the silent sentinels. Alice Paul's getting very frustrated. We need to do more. We've lost these votes in these several states. And she and Lucy Burns started to picket. And they picketed the White House. The first time in history that any groups had ever picketed the White House. The suffragists came up with that idea, and they did it, and that was Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. And they were silent sentinels. They didn't say a word. They held banners to give out their message. So they were peacefully protesting. The challenge came, that was January 1917 when they first started. They did this for 2.5 years. They had over 2,000 women participate 6 days a week in all kinds of weather. I don't know if they're on there. Sometimes in the cold weather, they would stand on hot bricks to try to stay warm. And then when war broke out, World War I broke out, and that's when, apparently in those days, the notion was, you're not supposed to picket a sitting president during war. I know, doesn't it sound a little funny to us? Back then, everybody rallied around the president. So the notion that the women would picket the president at a time of war, but their banners talked about, you're fighting for freedom overseas, half of our population can't vote, and so they were out there. And that's when they trumped up charges and arrested them and found ways to say they were disrupting traffic because people would come to watch them or whatever, and they jailed them. And now Alice Paul's experience and Lucy Burns, who had also been jailed in England, came to light because they were sent to this place called the Occoquan Workhouse. It's now a museum. They have lots of stuff about the suffrage movement. And they were treated horribly. They were given food that had worms in it. They were beaten. It was horrible. And they went on strike. They went on hunger strikes, and they were force-fed in Virginia. And Alice Paul barely survived. They all barely survived until word got out, because they were telling lies, frankly, to the press. Oh, they're fine. The women are fine. They're all being treated. They're getting 3 meals a day. They were getting meals through tubes of raw egg and milk. It was horrible. And when they took the tube out, they were bleeding. It was gross, and it was really, really horrible. And the food was hard if you did eat it. You couldn't. So let me just see what I have here. All right, so we'll come up to Massachusetts. What was so interesting, so in 1919, let me get my years right, February 24, 1919, Woodrow Wilson was in Europe on negotiations to end World War I. He was coming back to the States by ship. He almost went to New York, and they said, no, don't go to New York. The suffragists will crowd you out there, meet you. Okay, I'll go to Boston. Well, he did, but so did Alice Paul. So she came and met his boat. They met, some of you may have heard of, there's a restaurant on Park Street. Do I have the streets right? Park or Beacon? Park Street. Number 9 Park. Number 9 Park was the headquarters of the National Women's Party. Now, it was a small group then, but they met there, and when they learned they were doing a parade, this was in February. I haven't checked what was the weather in 1919 in February, but they had a parade for him outdoors, and these women had banners and went out and protested against Woodrow Wilson, asking him to push Congress for the 19th Amendment. And the amendment had been called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because other amendments kept coming in, and it kept getting later and later. The number kept going up, so it ended up at 19. But they were protesting. They were arrested and jailed before he even showed up. And they were arrested and jailed at the Charles Street jailhouse. the last women in the country jailed for the vote. Other women were arrested in New York and elsewhere, but the last women jailed for the vote were jailed at the Charles Street jailhouse. The Liberty Hotel, which is what it is now, knows a little bit about this. They have some pictures. We'd like to have them do a little bit more. So that was February 1919. Finally, in June 1919, the 19th Amendment was finally adopted by Congress. So that was February 1919, June 1919, adopted by Congress and sent to the states for ratification. I want to mention that Massachusetts, this is my sash, was the 8th state to ratify, which was pretty good. And that tells you, after this vote in 1915, when these women met at Faneuil Hall, they worked. They worked and helped get different people elected so that when it came to Massachusetts for a vote in the state legislature, they voted for it. And we were the 8th state to ratify. Some of the story you may know going forward, so it took from June, that was June 1919, it wasn't finally adopted until August 1920. And in between, I want to say in February 1920, the NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Carrie Chapman Catt, had the idea, number one, she believed that women would, in fact, finally get the vote. And she decided, we need an organization to help women vote. They are going to be nervous. They need education. They'll need to know about the candidates. And at their convention in February 1920, the NAWSA became the League of Women Voters. So when they talk about the League coming out of suffrage, it was direct. So that was in February. Fast forward, they need one more state to have 3/4 of the states. And the last state where that could happen was Tennessee. That's a southern state. That is not easy. And some people thought, well, maybe they'll debate and have lobbying for a couple of weeks. It was weeks on end. Carrie Chapman Catt went there. She thought she'd go for a couple of weeks. She was there for a couple of months, I think. And there was a pretty big battle going on between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, and they're two different styles because they considered Alice Paul this aggressive, militant, even though they didn't break any laws, versus Carrie Chapman Catt, who was prim and proper and would go to see the president and bring him flowers and have tea. And the truth in the end was that both were needed, frankly. I think they both played a role. So we're in Tennessee, and they're voting in the legislature on the floor, and the lobbyists have been there forever. The liquor industry was opposed to women getting the vote. The railroad industry was opposed. What did that mean? They were showering the legislators with all kinds of liquor and gifts to get their votes, and I think some money. So they were really up against a lot. And if you were opposed to women getting the vote, you wore a red rose. If you were supportive, you wore a yellow rose. So they were called the Yellow Roses. And a man named Harry Byrne was wearing a red rose on the floor. He was a young man, I think 23, 24 years old, and indicated he was supporting anti-suffrage, but had told the suffragists not to worry, he wasn't sure. But while he was on the floor, he had a note delivered to him from his mother. And Harry Byrne voted for suffrage. The place went into pandemonium. He had to escape through a window. They couldn't believe it. It was major, and it wasn't necessarily expected. And that's how they got the vote, by one person down to the bitter. And to catch up with my slides here. Oh, this was, so for the centennial, when Massachusetts became the 8th state, we did a centennial event at Faneuil Hall, June 25th, 2019, to commemorate it. And that's a group called, and I'm in there too, there's a group called History at Play, and they wrote a play about women voting. And that's the Boston Children's Chorus down below.
That's you next to the woman in the yellow,
I'm over on the right, up, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You?
I think this is me up here.
Yes.
Yeah.
over there. And then all of our sports. So that was a great night. This is the story of Harry Byrne that I was just telling, and his mother, Feb Byrne. And I want to mention as I leave this piece, I have now seen twice on Broadway, and it's recently closed, but the show called Suffs, Suffs, and it is this story, including Harry Byrne and his mother. And the show, she reads her letter to Harry, and it could just bring tears to your eyes. And the show also, there's a movie called Iron Jawed Angels about Alice Paul. It was an HBO movie. They're listed on our website. If anybody still has a DVD player, I think you can play it on a DVD. The libraries have them. So this was when they got the 36th state. That building is right across from the White House, and the park right across from the White House. That's Alice Paul at the top, sewing on the last star. The struggle for voting rights. The 19th Amendment does not discriminate. It says you may not discriminate on the basis of sex for voting. But other laws prevented people from voting. For the Japanese Americans, they took the vote of citizens in 1953. Indigenous people in 1962. It was a long road. There were lots of laws that had to change. It was 1924 for Native Americans. The Indian Citizenship Act declared that Native Americans were citizens, but Native Americans were still not eligible to vote in every state until 1962, when Utah became the last state to remove barriers. Asian Americans finally were granted citizenship in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, that all Asian Americans were granted the right to become citizens and vote. But there are still people in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico and Guam that they cannot vote in federal elections. This is African Americans fighting for the vote, protesting in the South, the Pettus Bridge, which I've been pleased to visit. And you can go on trips down there, which is really wonderful. And Fannie Lou Hamer, let me see. Fannie Lou Hamer, who you may have heard about. There are great books about her now, written by a fabulous woman at Simmons. PBS has done specials on her. Incredible, incredible woman. Finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 signed into law, which was a big deal. And as you know, today this is under attack, and there are sections of that that are being eliminated by Congress, and it's terrible, frankly. Let me see, so that's that one. And then what do we have? This is women's equality. What is that? I never heard of it growing up. Some of you may remember the name Bella Abzug. When she was in Congress, she got then to adopt a law that would commemorate the day that the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. So it was passed in Tennessee, I think it was August 18. It took until August 26 to get to Washington. It had to physically go to Washington and signed it into law. There's a story that it was done at night because the secretary was worried that Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt would be bickering. So he did it at night, I think. But it was August 26, 1920, that the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Thank you, Bella Abzug, for naming it Women's Equality Day. So we have been commemorating Women's Equality Day actually since 2011. And we do a theme each one, and these are all on our website. Let me just see what else we have here. Okay, 2020, just before the pandemic, a woman living in a nursing home, I believe, in Pasadena, California, had grown up in Rochester, New York. She knew all about Susan B. Anthony, who was from Rochester, and about women getting the vote. And she decided about 3 years out, we need to have a float in the Pasadena Rose Bowl parade. It took them, I think it was $300,000. You may know that every float has to be made only of leaves and natural flowers, right? So that is the Statue of Liberty out of eucalyptus leaves. And I saw it being made, these huge little leaves, and I had the honor to march in there. At this picture here are descendants of the suffragists. On the right, he is a descendant of Frederick Douglass. That's Colleen Jenkins. Next to him, she is the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She came and spoke in Boston when we did an event a few years ago. That's Michelle Duster, related to Ida B. Wells. And next to her, Harriet Tubman's descendant, and I believe, I have to read it. Yes, Susan B. Anthony's relative. So it was a great event. I had the great honor of meeting Dolores Huerta at this event. So it was, and then the pandemic. And so we made this film. It's a 30-minute film. It's online. It's on our website, so you can play it anytime you want. See if I've gotten. So the Equal Rights Amendment. Remember Alice Paul? 1920, they get the vote. 1923, Alice Paul and a few other people decide it's not enough. We need an Equal Rights Amendment. And so they drafted the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. And that is the Equal Rights Amendment we are still fighting for. That's a long story, as you know. And Alice Paul lived into the 70s. There are some recordings of her, so you can hear her voice, which was pretty amazing. These are some virtual events that we've done. They are online. I encourage you to see them anytime. I'll tell you about that. Oh, women's markers. There was so I serve on the National Votes for Women Trail. That's a national group. We meet once a month on Zoom. And an organization, the Pomeroy Foundation, decided to fund suffrage markers throughout the country. There are about 200 of them. We have 5. And there's our list of the 5 that we have. This was our unveilings of these. I mentioned Charles Remond. The one in the center is the Remond family. Because there were so many people who were suffragists in the family, we decided to do it for the whole family. Sarah Wall in Worcester, she owned a home in the 1800s, refused to pay her taxes because she couldn't vote. And then they wanted to reclaim the house, and she only got it back because people raised money to do that. And she became a speaker with Susan B. Anthony in Washington. Ann Page in Danvers, suffragist. And then we've done as well Mariah Baldwin in Cambridge, who I mentioned, and Sojourner Truth, who lived in Florence, Massachusetts for some time. And we were able to get a marker for her as well. So we'd love for you to follow us on social media at at MA Women's History. Okay, the swan boats. You can see they're wearing Votes for Women sashes. So the first time we did our event for Women's Equality Day at the Swan Boats was with Mayor Menino, may he rest in peace. He wanted to honor the Swan Boats because it's a private company, and they're wonderful, and they keep their prices low, as you may note. And so we said, great, we combined it with Women's Equality Day. And I'm going to leave you with one more story. And that is the feminist story of the Swan Boats. Richard Paget started the Swan Boats in the late 1800s, 1888, I think. And he built a boat with a swan that hid a paddle boat. He had this idea from a German opera, I believe. And he built his boat. He got his permits, he did it for 1 year, and then he died. And he was in his 40s, leaving his wife a widow with 4 children and no income. She decided to run the business and to grow this business. The business community in Boston in the 1800s was not in favor of women running businesses. So they said, well, you'll have to get signatures and you have to do that. She persevered for 30 years and ran the business. Her great-great-granddaughter and grandson run it today, Lynn Paget and Phil Paget. And so we love that story about Julia, that we like to keep telling. And every year for Women's Equality Day, they put out the sashes for us, Votes for Women. And those sashes were made by a friend of mine at Needham High School who had put those together. And they keep them. We love it. The Swan Boats, they keep them and use them, so they pull them out every year. We're looking forward to it. So I will end there. Thank you. Whoa.
I just
Yes, so it's actually coming to Boston in March. I don't know where that is. It may be going elsewhere too. Anyway, and we're hoping to get a night at the theater that we want to have it all for women's. We'd love to do it for the Mass Women's History Center. And for many, I did not mention, we have 200 nonprofit organizations that we partner with, and they're all on our website. So I encourage you to go on our website. You can come see me, sign up for emails. I promise we only send like 2 a month. But also check us out on social media, and there are cards and things you can take to find us, a pen with our name on it. So please do check us out. Thank you so much. Thank you.